So, thank you guys for joining us. Hello, Paula. Lovely to see you. And it's just a few words of introduction before we dive in. I've got some slides to show, of course, when talking about paintings. Just really about why this was something that I was interested in talking about and what the whole idea of this kind of series is. So, as you may have seen, this is part of a series of classes, shiurim, however you might want to call it, called I'm a Cultural Jew, Get Me Out of Here, which I couldn't pass up the pun and the opportunity to use. And I wanted to do so because I think a lot of us at SAMS and elsewhere kind of knee-jerk reactions say, well, I'm not religious, I'm a cultural Jew. And I'm not sure what that means because actually Judaism is a culture as well as a religion. And as a result, I think it's actually quite important for us in a religious space and religious way to learn about Jewish culture more broadly. And obviously, art is a big part of that. Art is a part of that's particularly close to my heart. Both of my parents are artists, and and for my many sins in the past life, I grew up constantly going to art museums as a child, and was a very weirdly well-educated child when it came to art history, and was surrounded by the ideas and smells and mess of art and painting for much of my life. And so it's always something that I'm kind of gravitated towards. I don't paint, never have painted, but um, I enjoy the history of art and the understanding of how art has been shaped by sometimes a few people making a big impact. What I want to talk about tonight is actually not Jewish art, but art by Jews. So there are Jewish artists who do Jewish art, if we might call it that, meaning their paintings or drawings or etchings or sculptures are primarily about Jewish subject matter. And that's actually not what I'm interested in this evening, at least, although there's some really interesting artists who have done work around depicting Jewish life. What I'm more interested in is how Jewish artists have had an impact on the development of modern art in particular in the course of the 20th century. And most of that impact, and it's been a pretty big impact, has been as a result of negative views in understanding the role in which Jewish people and Jewishness played in the development of art. And as the title of this evening's session indicated, a lot of that goes back actually to Nazi Germany and to the construction of the idea of degenerate art. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that and then looking at a series of examples of kind of Jewish artists, none of whom were particularly renowned for their Jewishness, and the way in which you can see a development in the style, and perhaps we can have a discussion about what we suspect that might mean. So I'm going to share the screen if that's okay. And um, right, hopefully you can see that. And hopefully you can see that big now. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up. Cool. Thank you, Nick. I think that was your thumb, but in front of Sarah. Maybe Sarah's thumb. Um, so, so I wanted to start with the title. It comes from a very particular thing, which is this exhibit, right? And my German isn't very good, so I'm not going to try and pronounce anything. But quite famously, in 1937, after the Nazis had taken power and after they'd started to establish certain cultural norms in Nazi Germany, they held a very famous exhibit called the Exhibit on Degenerate Art, which is the way in which we usually understand this phrase, Tartet Kunst. I don't know how to say the first word. Apologies to the German.
Entartete.
Thank you.
Entartete.
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 Um, um, Now, there's a great irony to this because actually, this phrase degenerate art, it actually largely is the result of a Jewish philosopher named Max Nordau, who is a very prominent Jewish thinker and also early Zionist, who was the one who really gave this language to German society at the time about how degeneracy was a result of kind of psychological malfunction, that people were not thinking straight and not seeing straight. There was something wrong with their brains, and as a result, they were producing increasingly abstract art. And the Nazis, although Nordau was a Jewish man and a Jewish philosopher and writing very often about Jewish topics. Nazis really seized on this idea of degenerate art being an example of society's decadence and society's influence by Jewish culture and Jewish people, and in particular saw this as evidence of the fact that the kind of body politic was literally sick, right? It's an exhibit identifying the ways in which we can see how art represents the illness of society in the Nazis' eyes. They opened it in Munich. It went over the summer of 1937, from July to November, I believe, and had 1 million people come in the first month, I believe, of the exhibit, which was a huge amount. It then went on tour all around Germany and was absolutely slammed everywhere it went. People gravitated towards this exhibit. You could see, and again, Helen, correct me if I'm wrong, but it says just underneath the title that entry is free. Right, this is not something that was limited to subscribers to the museum. This was a very purposeful political stunt to try and get people in to see the art. The art was displayed in a way, there's a couple photos of the exhibit itself. The art was displayed in a way that made it uncomfortable. Often the rooms were too small, so you're bumping up against sculptures and other people. A lot of the paintings were hung chaotically, and lots of them on the same wall, and some of them overlapping with each other. A lot of them are hung by kind of rope from the ceiling rather than on nails and with a wire. And the whole idea was to make people uncomfortable and to show them how degenerate art had become. And of course, the punchline was it was degenerate because of the Jews, because of the Jewish influence. Not all of the artists depicted were Jews. Actually, many of them weren't. But in the eyes of the Nazis, anyone who was degenerate was therefore Jewish, even if they weren't Jewish. The two became coterminous with each other. Um, this is just one example of one of the walls from the exhibit, and you can see there's several different paintings displayed here in a kind of chaotic fashion, as you would never do normally in an art gallery. And the text on top says German farmers, a Yiddish view, or a Jewish view. And they had found these series of paintings by Jewish artists, although I'm not sure, actually, it's hard to make out many of the names, how true that is, which depicted peasant German life. And of course, many of these are in quite an abstract, expressionist style, we would call it. We'll see many more examples of that. And to the German viewers and to the people who put on the exhibit, this is meant to illustrate actually how corrupt the Jewish view was, that they saw German in these kind of exaggerated, bizarre, animalistic ways, that because they kind of had this lack of understanding of German farmers, as a result, it showed how out of touch and unwell these Jewish artists were in their Jewish viewpoint on the situation. Um, you could have found plenty of hyper-realistic paintings of pastoral scenes from Jews. There were many Jews who were very big on painting pastoral scenes in Germany, including the classic kind of German romantic big sweeping landscapes. Of course, those weren't in the exhibit because they were trying to make a point about what kind of Jewish art they saw. Um, Found a really helpful quote here from an art historian who wrote a lot about this famous exhibit. I'll just read what it says. It says Hitler saw Greek and Roman art as uncontaminated by Jewish influences, which is why there was a focus on hyper neoclassicism. But modern art was seen as an act of aesthetic violence by the Jews against the German spirit. Such was true to Hitler, even though only Liebermann, Meitner, Freundlich, and Marc Chagall, among those who made significant contributions to the German modernist movement, were Jewish. But Hitler took upon himself the responsibility of deciding who, in matters of culture, thought and acted like a Jew. Right, and this again goes to that point that many of the people whose works ended up in this exhibit were not actually Jewish, but they became labeled as Jewish. In fact, one of them, out of the prior to the exhibit, the Nazi Party went and raided a bunch of paintings from people's private homes and museums around the country. They got about 5,000 paintings in storage in the months before. About 1,000 of them, the largest store, were actually paintings by a Nazi artist, a man who was a member of the Nazi Party and a very high-ranking one, who continued to paint his abstract art up until 1937, the month before the exhibit, when he got a very officious letter from Hitler with the official Nazi eagle seal saying you're no longer allowed to paint because your art is now Jewish. This is a guy who was actually a kind of Nazi officer who was being told that his art is Jewish and he doesn't know it. And it just really goes to show this isn't about the artist being Jewish. It's about the sense that Jewishness and abstraction are equal in some way in the eyes of the Nazis and demonstrate the sense that society is corrupt. Both complement each other. This is really interesting from a variety of point of views. This is a photo of one of the walls in the exhibit. Again, you can see paintings are crooked, they're next to each other, and there's kind of text superimposed over some of the paintings. There's sculptures in front of paintings. There's like tags on the paintings. I'm not sure what that's about. And it's very hard to make out what each of them are. I guess the tags are probably the labels, but they're put on there like shopping tags in the store. And the only I can't make out, and Helen or others who might know German, if you want to help me make out the part that I did make out, is that this is about race, right? This is a depiction of different um, Jewish painters, or so they call Jewish. I actually don't know how many are Jewish, who are painting and stylizing things around African imagery, often around black bodies, things that were very influenced by Fauvism, by Cubism, by interest in Africa for the first time. And
Yeah.
the translation I did find that I connected with this image is the Jewish longing for the wilderness reveals itself. In Germany, the Negro becomes the racial ideal of a degenerate art, right?
Yeah. I think the second line is something about it's being paid for by the taxes of the hardworking German people. I don't know about the
Yes.
first line.
Yes, a lot of these labels in the exhibit actually featured the price that the museums in Germany paid for them. So they would say, the Berlin Museum of Art paid this much money for this trash, right? And this is in the midst of course, looking back on the Weimar period on hyperinflation. People didn't have enough food to eat, and the museum is showing this is how much they paid for this horrible art. That's, of course, the message they were trying to send. So that would make sense talking about the taxes and the burden society. And
That's like something to do with black people being in heaven, hasn't it? It's heaven again.
Sorry, Paula, you're breaking up a little bit.
Sorry, I always do.
I heard.
I know the hymn is heaven in German. It says something about black people being in heaven, I think, the first line. I don't know whether I'm still breaking up.
No, I heard that. Yes, it's definitely here. I mean, this is from what I could make out, connects to this idea of the wilderness might be the same thing that's being translated as a heaven or whatever else. But I mean, the sense, we need a German scholar perhaps, but the sense is clear, right? That the idea that what upsets the Nazis is that Jews are romanticizing, they see, or promoting images of black bodies and black people. And therefore, this shows that the Jews are so degenerate that they actually think that black people and black bodies are something worth painting. So that these racialisms fit into and support each other in a really upsetting way. Um, and it's not at all about the Jewish content of the paintings. It's about the role that Jews play in facilitating these social problems, which is such an important thing to point out because this is language we hear a lot today, right? Is, oh, well, the Jews are the ones who kind of, want open immigration to bring refugees in to ruin our borders. And it's not necessarily always that people are identifying Jewishness as the problem, but the role that Jews play in society as globalists, as bankers, as pro-immigration, as George Soros puppets, as whatever. And there's a lot of that shows up in these Nazi things because people weren't dumb, and actually the Nazis weren't dumb. They went quite an indirect route often. So here the Jews are the villain because they are guilty of kind of betraying whiteness, which is what's really quite interesting. And there's a lot more perhaps to say about that trifecta of Germans, Jews, and black people.
I think in that first line, actually, it's not Schwarz. I think it's about gossip, Schwätzen. But I'm sure you're right about the quote about the Negro. But it's, the hysterical gossip about I don't know. I don't quite understand that bit, but decadent art. Yeah. Anyway, it's really interesting. I've never seen this before.
I love all the exclamation points, right? Like they were like to write on a board exclamation points and scare quotes every time that they had this is one of the places the exhibit went, right? You can see the queue, right? And just the regular people lined up around the block families, children, men, women, to go in and see all of this horrible, degenerate art. Often in the promotional images, they stylize the text actually to look kind of cubistic, abstract, as you can see here, where the text is outside. And often they put the word Kunst or art in scare quotes. Right, degenerate art is often the way in which it's depicted. Um, so the reason I kind of wanted to start with this rather than just jumping into looking at different Jewish painters is because actually it's sometimes the result of other people's mistaken views that we try and see trends in history. And although there are many Jews who have had a big impact on modern art, there wasn't some big conspiracy for Jews to kind of, change the way that art functioned. The reason that Jews perhaps had such a big influence is because many Jewish people obviously were more aware of political developments and very involved in the developing styles of art, and usually happier to embrace what was called, or maybe called, the avant-garde of art, right? The faster moving, the more progressive, the more radical. Whenever there was a new avant-garde movement to embrace, Jews were at the forefront of it, every time. And that really kind of gave weight to this idea that there was some kind of agenda behind Jewish influence on art in Nazi Germany. So to take us back a little bit, right, and to talk about some examples in terms of this idea of Jews and avant-garde, the best place to start is actually with an unlikely character many people actually don't realize is Jewish, who's Camille Pissarro, who is the founder, I guess, in some sense, or one of the first and most significant Impressionists, right? Before Monet and Manet and all the rest. And Pissarro actually was one of the ones who really started to break down the conventions of 19th century art, hyperrealism, classical forms, kind of color accuracy, and started to tinker with it. And the way that he did that, by changing the way things are depicted, changing brushstrokes, changing style and color and shape, really became what we called Impressionism later. And although now Impressionism seems very staid and very kind of establishment, at the time it wasn't, and it was actually something extremely radical. And people reacted, in France especially, where it was predominantly exhibited, people reacted to the early Impressionists the same way that many people in Germany reacted to the Expressionists later, and the same way that people kind of reacted in different countries at different times to all of these avant-garde movements. So it doesn't look terribly avant-garde to us now, because it's been a while, but at the time, this particular style would have been very much so. And you can see, right, if you kind of haven't seen this sort of work in person, a huge part of it relies on texture. So rather than it being a accurate depiction of an image of the Louvre, which is of course what this is, pretty recognizable, right? Even though it's abstracted a little bit by virtue of the painting style, and by emphasizing the texture of the paint and the texture of the canvas, you can even in this image see the lines of the canvas behind, right? Because the paint was relatively thin. You can see the texture of the brush strokes. These were things that were purposely hidden in the kind of dominant art styles in France before then. It was the acceptable way, and the only acceptable way, to make sure that your brushstrokes were not visible, and to make sure that you made sure that everything was accurate, realistically depicted, proportional, etc. Which is why people like Van Gogh and others, now there are heroes, but at the time they were largely disregarded because they went so far outside the norm of what was considered to be acceptable art. Of course, Van Gogh is very big on the texture that becomes something that we see in Pissarro and others, and has an influence, of course, on Impressionism. So Pissarro was a Sephardi Jew, born to a Spanish-Portuguese family, I think in the island of St. Thomas, kind of traveled quite a bit throughout his life, was fairly well off, was fairly well established, didn't face a lot of conflict, never really made a point of his Jewishness. Like many of these artists, actually all of the artists we're going to talk about never made a point of their Jewishness and never depicted Jewish subjects, right? All of Pissarro's paintings that I'm aware of are pretty conventional impressionist landscapes, nature scenes, city scenes like this, right? And yet, in some way, his Jewish identity maybe is part of what helped him to be at the forefront of this new movement. And that's something we're going to see many times over, perhaps, is that often when movements are changing and art is developing and there's new, unusual things, you find Jewish people there, which is what the Nazis are picking up on in a negative way, but I actually think is quite a positive in some way. Why do we find Jewish people there every time? Why are we always Jewish people always at the avant-garde of art? I'm not sure I have an answer, or there is an answer. But I would guess it has to do something with kind of some degree of familiarity with trends in society, a certain awareness in how society is developing, and a suspicion in some way of normative establishment, societal ways of doing things, especially something like art. So this is the very beginning of the 20th century. We're going to try and go all the way through the 20th century with a couple of examples. And we're going to leave Impressionism behind, and kind of jump a little bit, a couple years back in time, but across to Crimea, and to a really interesting painter. His name is Isaac Levitan, who was actually very influential in the Slavic language sphere at the time. He was someone who was fairly well known, I believe, although now his art is not very well known and not exhibited very often. And he was someone who was fairly typical in some way in terms of his subject matter, mostly nature paintings, mostly focused on places in Ukraine, what's now Ukraine, and Western Russia, timely. Um, and he's classified as a realist, which is a bit funny because if you look at this, you can see ways in which he's purposefully choosing not to be realistic. And there's almost a way in which this is moving towards what we call expressionistic. If you look at the trees on the right side, right, you can see he's actually very much smeared and blurred the paint on the trees that are on the fringes of the image. And the result is that the trees that are in the center of the image kind of have a little bit more clarity. And it works the same way, almost like an eye works, right? Your eye tends to focus on the things in the center, and the things on the edges become blurry at the peripheral vision. And so he's playing with the shadows and the light and the kind of smeared paint, especially on that right side, to kind of create this sense of a realism, not of depiction, but of experience. Right? This isn't the realism in which his painting represents exactly what you would see if you were standing in that place. It's more the realism of his painting represents what your eye would see when seeing this image in some way, which is very interesting because that's a development in itself. And you can see it in many of his other works. If you look up his works, he has a really interesting style. There's a famous self-portrait he did of himself, which is really interesting as well in terms of how he depicts kind of human subjects. But all of his landscapes, and as far as I know, almost all of his work are landscapes, show that in the Eastern European sphere, in the Slavic sphere, there was the same kind of things happening as in Western Europe. Obviously, they're aware of Impressionism developing, and you can see the same thing being led. If there's anyone in the Eastern European painting world who has inklings of the same kind of Impressionism that becomes very dominant in France, it's this guy, Isaac Levitan. He's not the only one, he's not the only Jewish one, but he actually is quite a master at the development of this non-realistic realism. And you can see from Pissarro, from Levitan, we're starting to kind of detach ourselves from accurate depiction of reality. And the timing is quite important in some way, right? The beginning of the 20th century quickly degenerates, we might say. So this is a perhaps a famous one. You don't need to adjust your screens. I didn't actually stretch this image. It looks like I did the thing on computers people often do where they put the image in the wrong proportions. Now it's all squished, right? It's not squished, and that is in fact the way in which it is painted. And many people may know, because he became quite famous for it, Amedeo Modigliani. This is one of many portraits he did in the earlier part of his career. He was also a sculptor, but he was someone who was open to the developing trends in society around him. Interestingly, he was someone who spent a lot of his time studying much older art. He studied a lot of Renaissance art at a time that people generally didn't talk about the Renaissance. And you can see some of that influence in the way in which he depicts human figures. But it's obviously non-realistic. It kind of makes me nauseous and dizzy to look at not because of it's unattractive, but because of the proportions. If you look at the room and the wall behind her, try and figure out what shape that room is. Like, where's the floor? Which way does the wall go? Which way does this door open? Where is there a door? Does the door go in or out? Is there a hallway? You actually can't tell, right? And it's not because he's not a gifted painter, because there's plenty of places where Modigliani in his earlier years did quite a bit more realistic type work. So he has the skill. It's not just that he can't paint it accurately. He's choosing not to paint it accurately. He's choosing to paint it in a way that purposefully is far from reality. He was particularly focused on portraits, particularly focused on very long, narrow human forms, usually female forms. We didn't get to see a great deal of the development of his style as an artist because he died at the age of 35 in 1920. So this is towards the end of his very short career. But in that time, so in the 1910s, you can see as the First World War is going on, which is quite important. He goes from having a fairly traditional Renaissance focused, very classical Italian style to gradually detaching from reality, gradually making things more dramatic, more bizarre, more unusual, not unbeautiful, but purposefully unreal. And this is a great example, this portrait he did here. And of course, 1917 being the conclusion, well, nearly the conclusion of the First World War, a time when many people were questioning whether what they believed to be real was really real. Nobody was prepared to accept that the horrors of the First World War were actually happening. And the result was that a lot of people changed the way in which they viewed reality, right? And actually, art was no longer about depicting what's in front of you, but rather depicting how it feels, which now we take for granted. But at the time, was considered quite radical. He wasn't wildly successful selling these portraits, as most artists who are now praised were not. And he grew up in quite a Jewish community in Livorno, a Sephardic Jewish community, but didn't necessarily have any connection to Judaism. He doesn't paint Jewish subject matter. Like all the other artists we're looking at, he wasn't particularly connected to Jewish life. He was very proud of the fact that evidently his family was related to Spinoza, but other than that, he doesn't really claim much in the things that he wrote about his Judaism. So now we're going to jump back to Germany a few years later. This is a really interesting guy who actually is deeply understudied, named Otto Freundlich. And this piece is from 1922. And this is really important in some way because this is where, so Freundlich was one of the main people featured in the Degenerate art exhibit, because obviously it was all about German art. They weren't so bothered about French art and Russian art and then the other type of art. They were interested in German art and how Jews had corrupted pure classical romantic German art for the sake of harsh, nasty, disgusting expressionism. And nobody was more a target for this than Freundlich, who was Jewish and again didn't paint Jewish subject matter, secular like all of these people. But you can see that this portrait is very unusual for the time, right? Not only is it a weird angle, a weird composition, it's a portrait, but it's not of the whole face, right? The mouth is cut off. It's kind of half profile, not sure where the eyes are going. You only really get a sense of its portraiture the further back you step when the pieces kind of come together. And obviously, it makes no effort to be realistic. Or this is a portrait that he made of himself, and he's using large blocks of color. He's also using, and again to the point of Pissarro, he's using ways of distressing the paint and changing the texture of the paint to purposefully show its painterliness. If you look at the brown piece on the left, you can see he went to great effort to demonstrate where the brushstrokes are, to show the flow of the brushstrokes. They're going in different directions. This would have been such a chaotic thing to do at the time that it would have been a bit mad, which is exactly what many people thought it was, is a bit mad. You can see in the green piece that's under the right eye, he purposely dripped water into the paint as it was drawing, so there's like a texture there, but only in that piece. Other pieces, there seems to be kind of some kind of mica dust. It's hard to tell from the image on the internet. But there's a actually purposeful use of texture in order to separate and differentiate the colors and to make them stand out. Freundlich was a big admirer and a friend of Picasso. And so, there's a interesting piece around the development of Cubism via Picasso, primarily in Spain and elsewhere, versus what was going on in Germany with this kind of new expressionism. This is the Weimar period after the First World War, before the Second World War. Things are both very good and very bad at the same time. There's a deep amount of instability. There was a revolution, an attempted coup in Germany just before this. This is 1922. There's going to be more attempts just after. This is the time of cabaret and of surrealism and Dada and all of these things which are really challenging reality, right? Reality is now something which is up for grabs. Things are not as they seem. There's a lot of interest in magic, in occultism, and a lot of that reflects itself in the development of painting. And as painting is more open to abstraction, it is the Jewish painters in the community who are the ones really innovating with abstraction. And this self-portrait is such a great example of that. You can see how abstraction is now becoming a key part of what he's doing. However, it's still a head. It's still a self-portrait. It's still quite clear what's going on. We're going to come back to Freundlich in a few slides, and it'll be quite different because time's going to go on, it develops further. So that's the piece about the 1920s, is there's still some connection to what's going on in the world around, but it's not true anymore to depict things as they seem. Artists are interested in depicting things as they feel. Continuing the journey, we have always try and feature female artists as much as male, but it's hard because so many are poorly recorded. And this is a woman named Sonia Delaunay, and she gave herself a fancy, not nom de plume, I don't know, nom de brush. And her actual name was Sarah Stern, which is a little bit less jazzy, perhaps. And she was involved with both photography and painting and sculpture, and clearly was a very interesting and avant-garde person. She's usually classified as Cubist, or what's sometimes called Orphism, which is related to Cubism, but usually not in Spain. You can see that there's, I can't actually have any hope of reading it, but she included some text on the bottom left of this image. And you can see here for the first time in the ones we looked at, that actually this doesn't really depict anything that we can recognize, right? It depicts color and shape and movement. It depicts maybe a rough kind of sense of landscape, but you can't identify a body or a scene or a place. And the title, which is something that we'll see kind of gradually fall apart, Electric Prisms, doesn't really help us understand what's going on. You don't look at this and go, oh yeah, I know what that is. You look at it and you go, oh, that makes me feel a certain kind of way, or see something in it. And that's really where we start to see the wheels come off in realism, right? We've seen the development of it, we've seen the precursors, even just, on the one we looked at a moment ago, which is actually a couple of years after this. But already in 1914, at the beginning of the war, someone like Sonia Delaunay is really taking big strides to move towards a very, very abstract way of depicting the world around her. What do you guys see in this? This is now the stage where there's a lot of subjectivity. Anyone have any initial reactions?
It's like the sun, doesn't it? To me, it looks like the sun.
Yeah, there's a kind of radial kind of, the top one at least very much is where you expect the sun to be in an image.
I think I see architecture, or maybe kind of almost like pillars and like steam, like something to do with the development of technology.
On the bottom left, I can almost see water, and I could imagine a harbour, strangely, just on the bottom left.
Yeah, I kind of see what you mean.
Well, fields, you could like patchwork fields as well.
Yeah, and there's I mean, there's no right answer. There's something very naturalistic about it, and a lot of her pieces have this idea of using geometrical, colorful shapes to kind of invoke a natural image, but it's not precisely the image that you'd expect. She was doing this as early as 1911, playing with line and section and color and shape. And actually, she precedes almost all the men who get credit for abstraction, and often isn't actually herself recognized for the role that she played. But it partially comes again from her background, right? Like all of these artists, her name was Sarah Elisheva Stern. She grew up in Odessa, which was at the time, right? Odessa, of course, in southwest Ukraine, and which was at the time, I think, 40 or 50% Jewish as a city. So a huge Jewish population, a very Jewish environment. She was aware of and inspired by artists like Pissarro, right? She was kind of in touch with this avant-garde Jewish spirit of art in, liberal, sophisticated, cosmopolitan Europe, which Odessa was very much a part of. And she also used her experience, right? About not this painting, but a similar one that was a couple years before. And she mentioned that she had made a quilt for a child's crib, and that inspired her to try and create a similar image in a painting form, right? Which you can see, as you said, Helen, the patchwork nature of it. But that would have been very, very, very shocking to people that you would actually depict something like a quilt in art. And there's something very feminist about that, of taking a normally kind of textile art that's usually a women's domain and turning it into painting and putting it in front of people. But it's also something which represents kind of her sense of color and non-representation, and perhaps from a quite Jewish upbringing, right? One thing we'll see is these going to get more and more less and less representational. And sometimes you have to ask, when Jews are kind of constantly involved in the move towards abstraction, whether there is some piece of it that comes from a religious point, right? Of course, Judaism is very uncomfortable with the idea of representation. No Renaissance synagogue had ever as much art in it as Christian churches did. Some had quite representational art. Most avoided sculpture, but actually there's always been some anxiety about it. But unlike Islam, which is very clear and completely bans any type of representational art and only has endorsed geometrical and calligraphy as art, Judaism has never quite gone that far. And the rabbis introduced the idea that, well, it's fine to do representational stuff in 2D as long as you're not doing 3D. And that left a kind of ambiguity around this Jewish view of painting and portraiture and representation and landscape and whatever. But there's definitely some piece of the Jewish spirit, you might say, which resists this idea of trying to represent the world as being impossible. Jumping forward a little bit on our journey towards abstraction, again, this is another female artist, understudied French, Marcel Kahn, and the title starts to give it away at some point, abstract composition. Now, what does this say to you? Anyone recognize anything here? What does this look like?
Looks like vases on a shelf or something.
Yeah.
Like a B-day, doesn't it?
Looks like a B-day. There's something very bathroom vibes about it. I don't know if it's the shape of the white thing over on the left. It looks kind of like a toilet.
Could have won on the pottery thing last night. You see, they were making urinals.
Oh, were they?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I don't know that it strikes me as being anything other than very domestic. Right, which is, it's interesting because there's nothing really there that should be domestic. There's nothing explicitly representational. It's just kind of referential to many shapes and forms that you would expect to see in a house. And there's something quite interesting about that, actually, that she's very expert at using non-representational shapes and colors and ways of laying things on top of each other to suggest something to you, but in a way that leaves room for a great deal of ambiguity, which is something not too many of the abstract artists accomplish. Some go completely abstract, in which there's no suggestion of anything related to reality, and some actually, like the portrait we saw from Freundlich, still have a clear sentiment of, this is what I'm showing you a face, but I'm showing it to you in an abstracted way. This is the in-between point, where she's showing us something, and we kind of get a sense maybe of what it is, but actually there's still room for that subjectivity, for the ambiguity of what exactly it is. Again, from a Jewish family, but not necessarily ever known to depict Jewish things around her. Okay, back to Otto Freundlich for a minute. This is 1938. This is 16 years after the self-portrait. And those shapes and forms and textures in the self-portrait have now become the whole thing. Anyone see anything in this?
Movement.
Right. We've gotten to such an abstract point that actually all we see is the suggestion of movement, but not actually an image of anything. It's pretty.
You could see people walking, couldn't you? Because it's got those curves.
I can see that it's got suggestion of arms, isn't it? Shoulders, the kind of movement of walking. I'm seeing that.
Yeah, it's clear, hopefully, that like, you know, we've been on a journey of abstraction, and Freundlich has been on a journey, and whereas he was really pushing the boundary in 1922 by taking his face and making it less representational, now this is the ultimate point of kind of break with reality, right? Not him specifically, but this time period. This is, of course, just before the Second World War, right? Everything's about to go completely up, fall apart again. Freundlich himself is going to be tried to take refuge with Picasso from the Vichy France government, but ends up being shipped off to Majdanek and killed there, like many Jewish artists. And as a result, this is one of the last works he does because he has to go on the run very shortly after this when the war breaks out. So we don't get to see a great deal more of the development, but the development from 1922 to 1938 is clear, which is that reality is less and less relevant to what the painter wants to depict, which is something other than reality. And it has gone from here's something real but abstracted to what we just saw with Marcel Kahn, which is here's something which is abstracted and referential to real things, but non-specific, to now this doesn't actually explicitly reference anything. Right? It is just shapes, color, movement. You can see different things in it, but as you said, Paul, this is the stage where anyone can kind of see anything. This is complete subjectivity. We saw partial subjectivity, now we see complete subjectivity. And we're going to see that develop more, which is just what I want to illustrate partially. This is a year later, another Jewish artist. I believe this is Louis Shanker, who I believe lived in America, actually, so was less connected to the direct events of the war, but was very influenced perhaps by what he experienced there. Yes, he was in New York at the time, as some of the others we'll start to see are, because many of the ones who lived in Europe start to die. But I mean, this is, I don't know, uncomfortably abstract to some degree. What do you see in this? Anyone see anything?
Looks rather like animals and fish.
I see the fish, yeah.
Yeah.
I see Jonah's whale and a shofar.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting. I see what you mean. I wonder if there's, you know, of course, some would say it's irrelevant whether he intended that or not. If you see it, Sarah, then it's there. You know, it's he doesn't give it a title. It's untitled, like many paintings that are abstract. He doesn't sign it as far as I can see. It's just a series of hatch marks which look quite sloppy and shapes, one of which definitely kind of looks like a fish now that you say it. And I see the shofar as well. I'm not sure what the other one. The other one looks like a pelvis bone. And you kind of get this separation from anything that's identifiable. What were you going to say, Sarah? Sorry.
I was wondering if the others depict from some things from the Torah.
Not that I'm aware of, but it'd be interesting to look at whether you could say that actually he was kind of embedding some images there that were referential. I think it might be just our own bias that we see that shape and go, oh yes, that might be what it is. And that's the thing, is that when you get to this point of abstraction that many of these Jewish artists are leading on, you lose any ability for anyone to say what the painting is actually about. And of course, you can go to the Tate Modern today and see where the full extent of this goes, which is very far from reality. Things that don't even seem like art or painting anymore. This is a much more famous, perhaps, version of this American expression with abstract expressionism. This is after the war. Mark Rothko, some people might be familiar with, whose paintings almost exclusively are color blocks and different colors and combined together. He was actually wildly successful with some of them, and he had some very wealthy donors who bought and supported his painting. America post-war was really in a different place than Europe post-war, of course, because the war didn't take place on American soil. And there was a lot more interest in developing an art form and an idiom that's unique to America. And that became what's called, in American terminology, abstract expressionism as a movement, abstract expressionism, which was led by almost exclusively Jewish painters, with the exception that one of the best known painters in abstract expressionism was Jackson Pollock, who was not Jewish. Right? Everyone knows Jackson Pollock and his strips. But he's a contemporary and colleague of Rothko, of Barnett Newman, of Helen Frankenthaler, each of which I have an example of, all of whom are Jews, many of whom are Jews who escaped from Europe or whose family escaped from Europe, and are bringing with them this subjectivity that they developed as a quite unique Jewish painting style, in which actually there is no object of the painting, there is no objectivity to the painting. It's purely about a disconnect from reality and a sense of feeling. As time goes on, Rothko gets even less colorful, actually, and it becomes just kind of one color. And some really took a note from his book. This is Barnett Newman, again Jewish, slightly younger than Rothko. I mean, this is a dramatic one for Newman. Many of his canvases are just a color with a line and a different color down the middle of it. We're getting to the point where, you know, many reasonable people look at it and go, okay, but how is that art? Which I think is a very valid question to be asking. And, you know, this is a series he did, interestingly, for a Jewish painter. He did a series across the course of his life about the stations of the cross. And this is the third station. I don't think he completed all of them, but quite a few of them are extant. And many of them are in a similar way, one or two colors, a line, a shape. You can see the way in which texture is being used. I believe he actually kind of like ripped the canvas or did something to distress the paint around that line on the right, so it's actually highlighted with white down the center and kind of a black shadow around it versus the line to his left, which is black on a white background. He put kind of a black line on the left, so it almost looks like a book spine. Don't know what else there is to say about it. Well, I mean, just to remind you where we started, right? We started with Camille Pissarro painting the Louvre, and that was 62 years before this. Not a very long time, but painting has changed a lot in a very short period of time. Last one for me is kind of taking Helen Frankenthaler, who's part of this group of Jewish abstract expressionists with Rothko and Barnett Newman and Jackson Pollock being the honorary non-Jew in the group. Like she continued to paint for a long course of her life up until fairly recently. And this is a piece of hers from 1992 called Adirondacks. The Adirondacks are a mountain range, by the way. This is, you know, doesn't look like a mountain. Why did she name it that? How is it a reference to the Adirondacks? Why the colors? Note the texture, right? We talked a lot about texture before, purposely doing things in a way that would have been perceived as sloppy. You can see on the right-hand side in the yellow, there's a drip, right? Where actually the paint that she put on dripped down and she let it drip down. There's smears, there's kind of, you know, purposefully ugliness that in a previous generation would have been seen as inappropriate, unacceptable. You know, you cannot imagine, if we take this 100 years back to 1882, the highlight perhaps of French painting of the academies and the salons of Paris, you could not have told them that 100 years on, this would be a painting that sold for millions of dollars and was featured in museums, because they wouldn't even have classified this as a painting, right? This is just paint. And I think that's what's so interesting, is how quickly painting changes. And just a few words, and then maybe if anyone else has some thoughts, I've been talking for too long. But just this development, all of these artists we looked at, from Pissarro to Frankenthaler, are Jews. None of them paint Jewish subject matter, but all of them are perhaps informed by their Jewish experience. Now, the Nazis characterized Jewish artists as degenerate, as kind of causing the breakdown of traditional art and of destroying the way in which art had been in the previous century, which actually is kind of true, right? The Jewish painters that we looked at are often at the forefront of movements in art which are pushing back against objectivity, around realism, trying to change the narrative around what they see. And maybe part of it comes from their Jewishness, from experience of being marginalized, from experience of the First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust, of reality being not what it seems. They encourage the idea that painting should be a depiction not of reality, but of emotion. And they do that by using paint differently, using canvas differently, using color differently. And it is quite a gradual development, although it happens fast in art terms. It's quite a gradual development in which you see Jewish artists from Pissarro and Levitan in the early part of the century starting to tinker with how you depict what's around you, to the self-portraiture of Freundlich trying to draw his face and messing with a little bit of what it looks like, to as we get closer to the Second World War and after the Second World War, things which have no relationship with reality whatsoever, and yet are dominant, mainstream, museum exhibited, highly valuable pieces, which show in some way the way in which the narrative of art changed. Is it only Jews who did that? Not at all. But there are many Jews who are at the forefront of that. And in some way, obviously the Nazis are very wrong about the way in which they characterize that Jewish influence on painting. But what they're not wrong about is that there was a big influence of Jewish painters on this push towards changing what painting is about, towards subjectivity and away from objectivity, and towards abstraction and away from realism. And I think that that's worth noting as a part of Jewish culture. And I think it's actually a good thing in some way, because the move towards subjectivity, although it sometimes goes too far, it allows the opportunity for people to find in art not just an accurate depiction of the world around them, but a way to express themselves and to understand the world around them. And someone who grew up in a lot of art museums, I always appreciated that. Any thoughts? Anyone have a theory about Jews and painting in the few minutes we have before we wrap up? You've heard enough of me.
It's something about the idea that individuals can express themselves in whatever way they want. It's not a sort of collective religion, like, I don't know, I don't want to generalize, but I would say like Buddhism, or I don't think I'm expressing myself very well, but an embrace of creativity in your own relationship with the world around you.
It's interesting. Yeah, maybe there is something there about how we're generally not very authoritarian as a religion, and your individual understanding is very valuable, and maybe that leads to a sense that art should be similar.
Or maybe being an outsider and an observer as well.
Yeah.
Actually, did you see the Helen Frankenthaler exhibition at the Dulwich Picture Gallery? Anybody? It was gorgeous, gorgeous. It was prints. She'd done prints onto sort of wood, so she had the grain of the wood.
Oh wow!
As part of it was just an amazing colour she'd created.
Wow, that's really cool. And I mean,
there's something. Sorry, no, my sound is awful. I think there's something about being disrupted that leads to progress. And if you think about young children, and if you go on holiday or you move somewhere, suddenly they make a big progress in their development. It suddenly jumps. And I wonder whether something similar happened. And obviously with the advent of cameras, it started all kinds of modern art, but that kind of big development amongst the Jewish population, maybe because of the disruption that was going on at that time as well.
Really interesting. It's certainly the case in kind of Jewish theology. Anytime that there's a big upheaval, there's a catastrophe, it also leads to a great deal of creativity. The most creative times in Jewish history are just after or during really horrible, catastrophic times. And that seems to be, we see these big jumps around the First World War, the Second World War, and it makes sense that we as a people in general, but as particularly Jewish people, particularly in Europe, used the medium of art to try and express that sense of kind of how different reality is than how it should have been. It's really interesting. Beryl, is that you?
Well, we probably see that in refugees, don't we? In modern refugees from different places. That actually there is, and people who are in transcultural situations, who actually the expression of their identity and the expression of who they are and how they feel is actually, for some, is actually quite therapeutic, and particularly if it can come out of trauma, or it can be used to recover from trauma.
Yeah, it's absolutely the case, right? That many of the artists that are most praised today are artists themselves have come from traumatic backgrounds or refugee backgrounds, and there's a great deal of creativity that happens in those communities, and that often isn't actually as upheld as much as it should be by normative art establishments, whatever that means. But I remember in Minnesota, there's a community of Hmong people who had come from Vietnam and been moved during the Vietnam War to rural Minnesota, like nowhere further from their homeland than rural Minnesota. And they had a particular artistic tradition of weaving tapestries. And there was amazing tapestries that told a story. And there was one that hung in our university, this huge kind of, 20 by 30 foot tapestry, hand woven, that told the recent story of the Hmong people, in which it showed all of, the war and the soldiers and getting on boats and coming to Minnesota. And it was done in such a traditional style, but the subject matter was so modern and relevant. And there's a way in which that interaction of culture and culture kind of definitely is very fertile for the development of new styles. And Jews certainly have done that many times in terms of having to adapt and change and move cultures. So our culture is it's funny, right? Jewish culture it's both not really a thing because it's so construed by all these other cultures, right? Jews in France are drawing on French culture, Jews in Germany are drawing on German culture, but there is kind of a thematic ideological link sometimes that connects them, and we can see that even in what we looked at this evening. No, that's okay. We're going to wrap up. Just to say one more thing, which is in a couple weeks, we're going to have an event actually at Sam's where not only are we going to learn about Jewish painters as we've done tonight, but you're going to do some Jewish painting. So keep an eye out because we're going to have a little kind of painting evening at Sam's, inspired by some of these abstract expressionists, and it'll be a really good time in which we can kind of do a little bit of painting together. So I think that's in March, and there should be info coming out soon, but hopefully we can link it to some of the learning we've done this evening. Thank you guys for joining me, and hope it was an interesting little tour of painting by someone who is not an expert at all. And if I have gotten anything wrong, I apologize. I apologize to the German people for my attempt to read German aloud. There's
really good. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. There's a lot to learn.
It was really interesting.